The summer of 1838 hung heavy over the Mississippi Delta, the air thick with the smell of cotton and damp soil. The field stretched endlessly, a sea of white blooms under a merciless sun. In the distance, the river shimmered like liquid glass, lazy and deceptive in its beauty. Sarah had always loved that view. At 16, she still carried in her eyes a kind of quiet wonder, the fragile remnant of a childhood that had never truly been hers. She woke before dawn every day, when the sky was still the color of bruised flesh, and joined the others in silent procession toward the fields. The rhythm of life was simple, mechanical, predictable. The bell rang at 4:30. The overseer shouted. The day began. Sarah's hands were rough and scarred, her skin darkened by sun and labor, but she moved with a grace that seemed out of place in that world of exhaustion. She had learned to work fast, to pick cotton without tearing the bolls, to fill the sack evenly so that it would not strain her back too soon. Her mother, Hannah, had taught her that. Hannah was old now, no one knew her true age, but her body was still strong, her spirit unbroken in small, invisible ways. At night, when they returned to the quarters, Hannah sometimes hummed songs in a language Sarah did not understand. They were slow, mournful melodies, ancient as the ocean that had once carried Hannah across it. Sarah listened, not knowing that these were songs of loss, of memory, of homes that existed only in dreams. In those rare quiet moments, Sarah allowed herself to imagine other lives. She imagined freedom without quite knowing what the word meant. She imagined what it would feel like to walk without fear of the whip, to rest without guilt, to decide for herself when to speak, when to sleep. But such thoughts were dangerous, and she had learned to keep them hidden deep inside her, like small flickers of forbidden light. The plantation was vast, a world unto itself. The big house stood high on a hill, its columns gleaming like teeth against the dark trees. Sarah had never been inside, only glimpsed it from afar. It seemed unreal, a distant fortress belonging to another kind of people, people who did not sweat, who did not bleed, who did not bow their heads when spoken to. The master, Thomas Caldwell, was rarely seen in the fields, but everyone knew his presence. His shadow stretched across every acre, every life. Even the children knew to fall silent when his horse appeared on the horizon. That summer, a sense of unease began to creep through the quarters like a sickness. The overseer, Mr. Thompson, shouted more than usual. The punishments were harsher, more frequent. There were rumors, whispers carried in the night, that something was changing. A woman named Louisa had been sent away, no one knew where. Another, older man, had been beaten until he could no longer stand. Hannah told Sarah not to ask questions, not to look, not to listen. Work, she said. Quietly. Work and keep your eyes low. But Sarah had inherited her mother's strength and her father's defiance, though she did not yet understand that the latter would one day destroy her. The days passed in the same relentless pattern, and yet the air felt different. The master's visits to the fields grew more frequent. He watched the women longer than before, his gaze weighing, assessing. Sarah felt it on her skin like heat. Sometimes he would call the overseer to his side and speak in low tones, pointing toward one of the women. A week later, that woman would be gone, and no one would speak of her again. The silences became their own language. Everyone knew that when someone disappeared, it was best not to ask where. In early September, the harvest began. The work intensified, the hours stretched until they blurred into a single endless day. Sarah's body ached constantly, her fingers raw and bleeding, but she found small moments of peace in the rhythm of her movements. The wind whispered through the cotton plants like a lullaby, and for fleeting seconds she could almost pretend she was free. But freedom was not a word the world allowed her to use. It was a secret word, too powerful, too dangerous. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the fields glowed faintly in the afterlight, Sarah sat outside the cabin with her mother. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. Children played in the dust, chasing fireflies, their laughter sharp and brief like birdsong. It was the sound of something pure, untouched. Sarah smiled as she watched them, unaware that the world was already conspiring to steal even that small joy from her. Hannah's song rose again, low and broken, carried on the warm wind. It was not until years later that Sarah would understand that her mother had been singing a farewell. That night, Sarah dreamed of a river. In her dream, the water was dark and wide, flowing endlessly toward a horizon she could not see. She stood at its edge, her bare feet sinking into the mud, and felt the current tug at her gently, as if inviting her to step forward. On the other side, faintly visible in the mist, were figures, women, children, faces she almost recognized. They were calling to her, though she could not hear the words. She reached out, but before she could touch the water, she woke. The bell was ringing. The new day had begun. When she rose, something in the air felt altered, charged with unseen tension. The overseer's voice cut through the dawn, sharper than usual. He ordered 10 women to step forward, his tone clipped, his face unreadable. Sarah hesitated, unsure why her heart suddenly pounded. Her mother's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch, as if to hold her back, but it was too late. Thompson's finger pointed in her direction. "You," he said, his voice as cold as iron. She did not yet know what it meant. None of them did. But the silence that followed told her everything. By the time the sun rose fully above the fields, Sarah had been separated from the others, led away toward the big house that gleamed cruelly against the morning sky. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia and fear. Behind her, the voices of the fields continued, the songs, the cries, the sound of work beginning again. She looked back once, saw her mother standing in the distance, her figure small, motionless, framed against the golden light. That image would stay with her forever, the last trace of a life that was about to end. The world she knew, hard, brutal, yet familiar, was gone. In its place waited something colder, quieter, and infinitely more terrible. The air inside the cabin was thick and unmoving, heavy with the smell of damp wood, sweat, and fear. The single window let in a sliver of moonlight that carved pale lines across the floor. Sarah sat on her narrow bed, knees drawn to her chest, listening to the faint murmur of insects outside. Around her, the other women lay in uneasy silence. Their breathing came shallow, irregular, each one trapped inside her own thoughts, her own terror. The night felt endless, suspended between what had been and what was about to begin. Only 2 days had passed since Sarah had been moved from the main quarters to this smaller cabin near the big house. It was cleaner, quieter, less crowded. There were only 10 beds instead of 40. The women were given better food, larger portions, and were spared the harshest field labor. At first, Sarah had not known what to think. She had assumed it was a reward for good work, a small mercy from the master. But the faces of the others told her otherwise. None of them smiled. Their eyes were hollow, their movements cautious, deliberate. They spoke little, and when they did, their voices were flat, almost mechanical. The DOS passed slowly. The midwife, Mrs. Gable, came every Tuesday morning. She was a short, heavy-set white woman, her gray hair always pulled tightly under a bonnet. She carried a leather notebook and a metal case filled with instruments that glinted coldly in the light. She examined each woman in turn, her hands firm but not cruel. She asked questions Sarah did not understand, took notes, nodded, and moved on. It was a routine, clinical and repetitive, and though there was no violence in it, there was no kindness either. It was simply procedure. Sarah tried not to think too much about the strangeness of it all. She worked in the garden, washed the master's clothes, scrubbed the steps of the big house until her knees ached. The days blurred together in a haze of repetitive motion. Sometimes, while hanging linens on the line, she would look toward the horizon and wonder if this was what the rest of her life would be, a quieter form of captivity. She still did not know what purpose this place served, why they were chosen, why they were kept apart. The unease inside her grew like a slow fever. It happened one night in early October. The air was still hot and heavy, carrying the scent of magnolia and distant rain. Sarah had just lain down, her body tired from a day of washing and carrying water. She closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the low hum of frogs by the river, the creak of old wood. Then came the sound of boots outside, steady and deliberate. The door burst open, and a draft of humid air swept through the cabin. A lantern's glow sliced through the darkness. Mr. Thompson, the overseer, stepped inside. Behind him stood a man Sarah had never seen before, tall, dark-skinned, his body broad and muscular, his eyes downcast. His shoulders were lined with old scars that gleamed faintly in the lantern light. He looked like a shadow carved from flesh, heavy and silent. Mr. Thompson's expression was blank, detached, as though he were about to conduct a transaction, not an act of human cruelty. He gestured toward the man, then toward Sarah's bed. She understood nothing at first. Her body froze, her breath caught in her throat. Then the meaning came like a cold blade through her chest. The room around her seemed to fade. The air thickened until she could no longer draw it into her lungs. The other women lay still in their beds, eyes open, unmoving, witnesses bound by the same fear. Sarah's body trembled as she realized there would be no choice, no mercy. The man approached slowly, his steps hesitant, his head still bowed. His voice did not rise, there were no words, only silence and the unbearable sound of breathing. The world had shrunk to that one moment, that one command, that one act that would divide her life into before and after. The bed creaked. The lantern light flickered. The world became a blur of movement and pain. Sarah's mind tried to flee her body, to escape into some corner of memory where she was still a child, where her mother's voice still sang in the dark. But the body would not release her. Every every motion was burned into her nerves. The air pressed against her skin like a suffocating weight. Her nails dug into the wood of the bed frame until they split. She stared at the ceiling, at the uneven planks stained by years of smoke, and counted them one by one. When it was over, the man stepped back, his face unreadable, his shoulders shaking. He looked at her for a moment, as if wanting to speak, but no words came. Mr. Thompson turned and left without a glance, the door slamming shut behind him. The lantern's light vanished, plunging the room into darkness once more. For a long time, there was no sound. Then came the faint, stifled sobbing of Felicity, the youngest of the women, curled on the bed beside Sarah's. Her sobs were thin, fragile, like the whimper of a wounded animal. No one moved to comfort her. They all knew comfort had no place here. Sarah lay motionless, her body numb, her thoughts scattered like ashes. The night stretched on endlessly, each second dragging like a chain. She could still feel the weight of him, the smell of sweat and salt and fear clinging to her skin. Her body was no longer her own, it belonged to the master, to the overseer, to the system that had turned flesh into currency. She closed her eyes and waited for the dawn, for the faint light that would not bring hope but merely the continuation of the same nightmare. When morning came, the cabin was silent. The women rose in turn, their faces expressionless. Sarah moved as if underwater, every limb heavy. The marks on her wrists had darkened into bruises. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand. The day's work awaited, life went on, indifferent. Outside, the sun burned bright and cruel. Mr. Thompson stood by the door, his whip coiled at his side. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she understood then that she was no longer a person in his eyes, only a vessel. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the cabin changed. Sarah noticed the others watching her, not with pity, but with recognition. Each of them had gone through the same ritual, the same quiet destruction. There were a circle of women bound not by blood or friendship, but by shared violation. No one spoke of it. There was nothing to say. The silence between them was deeper than words, heavier than grief. At night, Sarah began to fear sleep. She would lie awake, staring into the darkness, listening for footsteps. Each creak of wood made her heart race. The sound of boots on dirt became a terror she could not escape. And though her body healed in the following weeks, something inside her had been torn beyond repair. Her thoughts no longer flowed freely, they circled endlessly around the same truth, that she no longer belonged to herself. The plantation was a machine, vast and unfeeling, built on the breaking of bodies and spirits. And now, she understood her place within it. She was not a worker. She was not even a person. She was a womb, a piece of the master's arithmetic, a number in a ledger yet to be written. The realization settled in her like a sickness, slow and incurable. One evening, as the sun sank red behind the cotton fields, Sarah stood by the fence and watched the horizon darken. The air smelled of earth and decay. Somewhere far off, a whip cracked, followed by a man's cry. The sound did not startle her. It was simply part of the landscape, like the rustle of the wind or the drone of insects. She felt nothing. The sky deepened into purple, then black, and she turned back toward the cabin. The others were already inside, lying in silence, waiting for sleep that would not come. Sarah lay down among them, her body stiff, her heart hollow. She stared into the dark, her eyes wide, unblinking. She had crossed a threshold she could never return from. The night had claimed her, and she knew, with the slow, cold certainty of truth, that it would never let her go. The days blurred together. Until they lost their names. Morning followed night with mechanical precision, and Sarah woke each time to the same sound, the bell, the shuffling of feet, the call of the overseer. The first weeks after that October night were a haze of pain and silence, but soon the rhythm of life in the breeding cabin reasserted itself. There was no pause for grief or reflection. Work continued, inspections continued, and the nights continued. The machine had swallowed her, and it did not care whether she bled or wept inside it. It only required that she function. The cabin had its own order, its own rules. Each woman had a cot, a small chest for rags and scraps, and a space barely wide enough to stand beside her bed. Every morning, they washed, dressed, and reported to their assigned chores. The garden had to be tended, the laundry scrubbed and hung, the chickens fed, the milk collected. The big house demanded constant attention, floors swept, windows cleaned, linens boiled. It was work that never ended, but it was not the work that defined them. What defined them happened in the dark, when the air grew heavy and footsteps approached. Mr. Thompson managed the schedule with military discipline. He carried a notebook, dog-eared and stained with sweat, in which each woman's name appeared beside a series of marks, dates, initials, coded symbols that only he and the master understood. The system was efficient, almost mathematical. Each visit, each act of forced coupling, was recorded and monitored. Pregnancies were noted in the margins, expected delivery dates calculated. It was as if he were tracking the yield of a crop, not the lives of human beings. The master's logic was simple: a woman's worth could be measured by the number of children she produced. Her body was an investment, her suffering an acceptable cost. Mrs. Gable's visits became more frequent as the months passed. She came every Tuesday with her notebook and her calm, businesslike demeanor. She examined bellies, check. Deep pulses, took notes in neat handwriting. Her hands were cool and professional. She spoke little, her face unreadable, but sometimes her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, a momentary crack in her practiced detachment, before she turned away and resumed her task. To her, this was work. Necessary, unpleasant perhaps, but profitable. Every living child born was a testament to her skill, another number added to the master's ledger. Sarah moved through these days like a shadow. Her body obeyed commands, her hands performed tasks, but her mind had retreated far away, into a place where she could not be touched. She learned to separate herself from what happened to her flesh. During the nights when the door opened and a man entered, sometimes the same, sometimes another, she let her mind drift beyond the cabin, beyond the fields, into an imagined sky without fences. She did not speak, did not cry. The women who cried were punished, or simply broke. She learned that silence was safer than resistance, emptiness safer than hope. Time ceased to have meaning. The seasons changed, the cotton bloomed and died, but inside the cabin everything remained the same. The air smelled of bodies and earth and birth. Sometimes, a woman disappeared, taken away to the infirmary, to another plantation, or to the grave. Another would arrive in her place, frightened and young, still believing that her suffering was a singular cruelty rather than part of a system. The older ones no longer explained anything. There was nothing to explain. The newcomers would learn soon enough. Felicity, once timid and quick to cry, became hollow-eyed and silent. She walked with a limp after a difficult birth, but she still worked, still obeyed, still endured. Rose, older and hardened, became a guide of sorts. She knew the herbs that could dull pain, the infusions that might prevent conception, though using them was dangerous. She whispered her knowledge only to those she trusted, in the dead of night, when the walls seemed to listen. Some of the women tried her methods, desperate to stop the cycle even for a little while. Most failed. The master's arithmetic tolerated no interruptions. Others broke in quieter ways. Melina began to laugh at odd moments, a soft, eerie sound that unsettled everyone. She talked to invisible children, humming lullabies into the empty air. When her mind finally collapsed completely, she was taken away, sold to another farm where madness was no obstacle to labor. Louisa stopped speaking altogether. Her face became a mask, her eyes flat as stone. She worked, ate, slept, and obeyed without expression. The overseers liked her that way. She was efficient, predictable, docile. The system had perfected her. Sarah's belly began to swell in February. The pregnancy was treated as a success, a reward. Her work was lightened, her rations increased. Mrs. Gable examined her more closely now, measuring her growth with cold precision. The master, in turn, smiled. W.H. And her name appeared in the ledger beside the notation confirmed. To him, it was proof that the experiment was working. He calculated the numbers in his office at night: cost of food, cost of medical care, expected sale price of offspring. The profit margins were generous. Each birth was a triumph of economics, a victory of ownership over the human soul. The other women watched Sarah with a detached mixture of pity and resignation. They knew the pattern too well: 9 months of anxious waiting, the agony of birth, a few months of nursing, then the separation. The baby would be sold or reassigned, and the cycle would begin again. It was a rhythm older than memory, older than resistance itself. Some prayed to their God for mercy. Others prayed for death. Sarah prayed for nothing. She had stopped believing that prayer reached anyone. At night, the cabin was filled with the sounds of breathing, the rustle of straw. Safer than resistance, emptiness safer than hope. Time ceased to have meaning. The seasons changed, the cotton bloomed and died, but inside the cabin everything remained the same. The air smelled of bodies and earth and birth. Sometimes, a woman disappeared, taken away to the infirmary, to another plantation, or to the grave. Another would arrive in her place, frightened and young, still believing that her suffering was a singular cruelty rather than part of a system. The older ones no longer explained anything. There was nothing to explain. The newcomers would learn soon enough. Felicity, once timid and quick to cry, became hollow-eyed and silent. She walked with a limp after a difficult birth, but she still worked, still obeyed, still endured. Rose, older and hardened, became a guide of sorts. She knew the herbs that could dull pain, the infusions that might prevent conception, though using them was dangerous. She whispered her knowledge only to those she trusted, in the dead of night, when the walls seemed to listen. Some of the women tried her methods, desperate to stop the cycle even for a little while. Most failed. The master's arithmetic tolerated no interruptions. Others broke in quieter ways. Melina began to laugh at odd moments, a soft, eerie sound that unsettled everyone. She talked to invisible children, humming lullabies into the empty air. When her mind finally collapsed completely, she was taken away, sold to another farm where madness was no obstacle to labor. Louisa stopped speaking altogether. Her face became a mask, her eyes flat as stone. She worked, ate, slept, and obeyed without expression. The overseers liked her that way. She was efficient, predictable, docile. The system had perfected her. Sarah's belly began to swell in February. The pregnancy was treated as a success, a reward. Her work was lightened, her rations increased. Mrs. Gable examined her more closely now, measuring her growth with cold precision. The master, in turn, smiled. W.H. And her name appeared in the ledger beside the notation confirmed. To him, it was proof that the experiment was working. He calculated the numbers in his office at night: cost of food, cost of medical care, expected sale price of offspring. The profit margins were generous. Each birth was a triumph of economics, a victory of ownership over the human soul. The other women watched Sarah with a detached mixture of pity and resignation. They knew the pattern too well: 9 months of anxious waiting, the agony of birth, a few months of nursing, then the separation. The baby would be sold or reassigned, and the cycle would begin again. It was a rhythm older than memory, older than resistance itself. Some prayed to their God for mercy. Others prayed for death. Sarah prayed for nothing. She had stopped believing that prayer reached anyone. At night, the cabin was filled with the sounds of breathing, the rustle of straw. System that turned life into property and time into profit. The rain came without warning that spring, soft at first, then steady, falling in long silver threads that turned the fields to mirrors. For weeks the air had been dry and heavy, and when the storm arrived it felt like the world exhaling after too long holding its breath. The smell of wet earth filled the air. The sky was low, gray, endless. The cotton fields disappeared beneath the mist, and for a moment the plantation seemed almost beautiful. Sarah stood under the eaves of the laundry shed, her hands still damp from washing, watching the rain slide down the roof in quiet streams. The others had gone inside, but she stayed. It was the first sound in months that did not carry the weight of orders or cries. It was just rain, falling for itself. She was thinner now, her skin stretched over bone, but there was still something luminous about her face when she looked at the sky. The months of labor, of silence, of waiting had carved her into someone unrecognizable. Yet in that moment, with her hair clinging to her temples and her dress soaked through, she looked alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. She closed her eyes and let the rain touch her skin. It felt clean, cool, forgiving. She thought of the river she had seen in dreams, the one that had always called to her, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself imagine that the world beyond the fence might still exist. When the storm passed, the air was filled with the scent of new grass and smoke. That evening, the sun broke through the clouds, and the sky turned a deep gold. Sarah returned to the cabin as the light faded, her feet sinking into the soft earth. The world looked washed, renewed, as if some quiet grace had slipped into it unnoticed. Inside, the women sat around a small fire, drying clothes, mending tears, moving with the slow rhythm of exhaustion. A child whimpered softly in the corner, one of the few still allowed to sta. Why for now? The sound was small, fragile, but it made something stir in Sarah's chest, something she had thought long dead. Her own child had been taken months ago. She had not seen him since. Sometimes she still woke in the night, her hands reaching instinctively for the space beside her, as if he were there. But she had learned not to speak his name, not to remember his face too clearly. Memory was a dangerous form of defiance. Yet the sound of the crying baby pierced through the walls she had built around herself. She found her gaze drawn to the bundle of cloth where the infant lay, his skin dark and new, his tiny fingers curling in the air. His mother, Ruth, was too weak to move. Fever had burned through her for days, and her eyes were dull with the distant look of someone who had already begun to leave. Sarah hesitated only a moment before moving closer. The baby's cries trembled on the edge of silence. She knelt beside him, her hands uncertain, as though afraid. Her touch might break him. The firelight flickered across his face, soft and small, a fragile echo of all that had been taken from her. She lifted him, feeling the warmth of his body seep into her arms. His breathing was shallow, quick, but steady. His eyes fluttered open, dark, unknowing, searching. She rocked him gently, her movements instinctive, ancient. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no overseer, no ledger, no command. There was only the small weight of life against her chest and the rhythm of her heart, steady and human. The other women watched silently. No one spoke, but their eyes softened. It was as if they, too, were reminded of something long forgotten, that tenderness could survive even here, in this place built to crush it. Sarah hummed, barely a sound, more breath than song. It was one of her mother's melodies, a fragment of something older than words. The baby quieted, his tiny body relaxing against her. The fire crackled, rain dripped from the roof, and for a few fleeting minutes, the cabin was filled not with sorrow but with something close to peace. In those moments, Sarah imagined a different life, one where she could keep this child, where no one would take him, where the mornings were filled not with the sound of bells but with laughter. She saw herself walking through a field, the sun warm on her shoulders, the boy running ahead of her, free. She saw water, endless and blue, and thought of the river again, not as escape but as return. The vision felt almost real, fragile but intoxicating. It filled her chest until it ached. She had no name for this feeling anymore, love was a word she no longer dared to use. But whatever it was alive, pulsing, defiant. Night fell slowly, painting the world in deep shadows. Sarah remained by the fire long after the others had gone to their beds. The child slept in her arms, his breath warm against her skin. Outside, the frogs sang, and the stars began to emerge, faint and far away. She looked at the sky through the cracks in the roof and wondered if her mother had once looked at the same stars, if the women before her had done the same, searched the night for proof that the world was larger than their pain. The thought comforted her. For the first time in years, she felt connected to something infinite, something that no man could own. But beneath that fragile peace, the truth lingered like a shadow. Ruth's breathing grew shallower through the night. By morning, she was gone, her body still and her eyes open toward the light that filtered through the slats. The child stirred, restless, unaware of what had happened. Sarah felt the weight of both life and death in her arms, one warm, one cold. She did not cry. There were no tears left in her. Instead, she rose and stepped outside. The air was cool, touched by the scent of the storm still lingering on the grass. The sun was Listen to every silence, every breath, every fragment of a life that was never meant to be remembered, then you are part of something larger than this story. You are sitting in the same quiet where she once sat, breathing the same air that still carries her absence. Sarah is gone, but her echoes are not. They live in the space between words, and the ache that settles when the story ends and the world keeps turning as if nothing happened. That ache is important. It is the proof that you are still human. Stories like hers do not belong to the past. They exist here, now, beneath the surface of every comfort, every convenience we mistake for progress. The history of pain is not buried, it seeps through the soil, through bloodlines, through memory. For generations, people have built their lives on the silence of women like Sarah. They walked over graves without names, wrote ledgers instead of stories, recorded prices instead of births. But numbers cannot erase what once breathed. If you felt sorrow, if you felt anger, if something inside you twisted while reading, let it stay. Do not push it away. This discomfort is the thread that connects you to the truth. What happened to her was not an isolated cruelty. It was a system, vast and deliberate, designed to turn human bodies into instruments of profit, to erase identity until obedience became the only form of survival. The world learned to look away from it. The world still does. So now, it is your turn to look and not turn away. To remember that Sarah's voice, though silenced in life, can still be heard if we are willing to listen. To understand that memory is not a passive act but a form of resistance. Every time you speak her name, every time you share her story, she exists again, not as a ghost of suffering but as a witness to the truth that was hidden. History will tell you numbers. It will speak of trade, of economy, of the rise and fall of nations. But behind every statistic was a face like hers, eyes that on. Seas saw light, hands that once held a child, a heart that once dared to love in a world built to destroy love. Remember that when you hear the word slavery. It was not an abstract horror, it was this, a woman with a name, a body, a voice, and a silence that still demands to be broken. If you are still here, it means you chose not to look away. It means that, for a brief moment, the distance between past and present collapsed, and you stood face to face with her. That is all she ever wanted, to be seen, to be known, to not vanish completely. You have already honored her by listening. But memory dies in silence. Keep it alive by speaking. Tell someone what you felt. Tell them about the cruelty, about the strength, about the unbearable quiet at the end. Tell them that behind every freedom we take for granted lies a story paid for in pain. We live in a time that teaches us to move on quickly, to forget, to consume, and replace. But some things must not be replaced. Some stories must live in the space between our conversations, uncomfortable and unfinished. Sarah's story is one of them. It asks for nothing but remembrance. There will be no monument for her, no marble statue, no marked grave where flowers can be laid. But if you carry her in your thoughts, if her image remains somewhere in the folds of your mind long after the screen fades to black, then that is enough. Because that is how the forgotten are brought back, not by stone, but by empathy. You may never know what became of the children born in that cabin. Their names were lost, their faces unrecorded, their futures swallowed by history. But somewhere, in the lineage of time, their blood still flows. Somewhere, in a city street, in a field, in a voice rising in protest or a mother's lullaby, they live. When you listen carefully, you can still hear them breathing through the centuries. If this story left you silent, let the silence be sacred. But when you speak again, speak with the weight of knowing. Do not let her vanish into the comfort of forgetfulness. Remember Sarah. Remember Felicity. Remember the thousands who were reduced to numbers and yet remained human in ways their masters could never understand. And now, before you close this window, before you move on to the next story, stop for a moment. Ask yourself what it means to live in a world built on the bones of those who had no voice. Ask yourself what you can do, not to fix the past, for that is impossible, but to make the present less silent. Because while we speak of them, they breathe again. While we remember, they are not lost. If you have reached the end, thank you. It means you listened. It means you cared. It means that somewhere, across the distance of time, Sarah's voice found a place to rest, inside you. Now, do not let it fade. Carry it forward. Share it. Because as long as someone remembers, she is not gone. And as long as we keep remembering, the darkness that made her story possible will never be complete again.